Okay, thank you everybody for calling in to the Specops Deploy OS Components webinar. I'm Heather Patson and I'm the product specialist and your host today. So a little bit about me. I'm a product specialist here at Specops. I've been working in Windows infrastructure for around 16 years and I'm a graduate from Drexel University. A few things that I enjoy doing is traveling and dancing and usually busy with my kids at karate. Those of you who joined 2 weeks ago knew I had my colleague and friend Johan Soderstrom present it with me. He is on vacation this week, but he will return again in 2 weeks for when we talk about app deploy. So those of you who may have attended before, last week we had an intro week on July 23rd. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Specops Deploy OS components. And as you can see, in future weeks, we'll be diving into app deploy and some advanced techniques and upgrading. So our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about group policies, and then we're really going to spend most of the time diving into the Deploy OS admin console and all the different components of that, because that's where you do most of your administrating of Deploy OS from. And then we're going to have time for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions as I go through the material, feel free to type the questions in the Q&A box. And as we finish up, I'll address any questions you have. So feel free to ask anything, and I will catch up through them at the end of everything. So let's get started and dive into it. Group policies. So and many of you know who have used Specops software, most of our software does integrate and relies on group policies. And that's how we give you the automation that you can have when you want to deploy an operating system and not have to hit F12 or select an operating system image to have that. You can just click on it and go because of group policies. And we also allow them to have specific OS related setting in group policies. We enable the real-time logging. You could set your local administrator password and do your regional settings. Now in Deploy, we do have a default policy, and that's to kind of catch up with anyone who doesn't get a specific group policy object with Deploy and as a fallback. But there are actually a few extra settings that you get with relying on the group policies, and I'll go into that and explain what they are when we're at that point. But the OS admin console, that's where the meat of it is. You can monitor your Deploy OS infrastructure. This is where you can configure your Active Directory infrastructure for the deployments, and you can manage and publish your deployment repository. So the server tab is the first tab that you get in there, and that's where you will take care of your infrastructure, your image server and your deployment server. And that's where the publishing is done from. So let's just go ahead and take a look at that, because I think you will see more if we look at that versus going into a bunch of PowerPoint slides. So here's the first tab, the server tab. You have your image server. So in your environment, you only need to have one image server, though with the more recent versions of Deploy, we allow for more than one image server because we do have the deployment group concept, which allows you to have more than one. Because a lot of times that you may want to be able to support both XP and Windows 8.1. So we evolved the product to allow for 2 different image servers to run each version of MDT. If you're not worried about XP anymore, then you only need one image server in your environment. Then we also have the deployment server, which has the read-only copy of your build chairs. And you can have more than one of these in your environment. So if you have several locations and you do want a local copy of your build chairs, you can deploy more than one deployment server. And you do that right here from the console. That you would click on here, map to your server, and go through the wizard. And that will install Windows deployment services and the deployment server role on that server that you have. Now, if your deployment server is not your image server, the DFS replication will also be set up, and you'll actually monitor that right in the screen. And you can see the bits going as you publish your deployment repository and do that. Speaking of publishing your deployment repository, you do that from your image server icon. You can right-click and hit that. And as any of you out there have added images or drivers, you'll see that's something that will happen automatically, because once you do make changes to the image server, then it's going to publish to those read-only shares that you do the builds from. A few other things that you would do from the screen is you can actually restart your DFS replication if you have that. And if you do want to restart your image server service, do that right from here also. On the deployment server side, you can restart WDS if you need to, or the DFSR on your deployment servers. And you can also restart the deployment service. Here is where you would go in and you would actually upgrade your deployment servers or install them or uninstall them if you need to. All right, let's go to the next console. So images and packages, that's the second tab. And that's probably one of the more important parts of the console besides the drivers. Because here you would put in your source files from the original source. You would initiate your operating system captures. If you have any WIM files and you want to point them in, you can import your captured image there. Before we jump into looking at that though, I do want to take a moment to talk about the types of images we have. There's three main that we talk about at Specops: a flat image, a thin image, and a thick image. The flat image, that is pretty much your source files, your vanilla Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1. No patches, no applications, nothing else. And for those of you who've actually started using Specops already, once we do the install, the first thing we ask you to do after you install your deployment server is import source files for an operating system. Because that's underlying in MDT, we create all the task sequences, so we do need the source files. And even once you start capturing images, for every version of an operating system there is, you need to actually have the source files imported. And that's flat, and you can use that and deploy that, no problem. When we talk about a thin image, that's a captured image, and all that is your source files with patches and Windows updates. There's no applications on that. And then a lot of times, if you want to go the thin image route, then you can turn around and use apt deploy and push out all of your images. Now, sometimes you might want to have an image with your applications, which we refer to as a thick image. And the way we actually recommend the best practice, it's not installing the applications right on the VM with the image. It's when you create that computer you're going to take the image from, deploy your applications to that machine with apt deploy, then cut the image. And that's the thick image. And we're going to be spending a lot more time talking about that next week, so I'm not going to really spend the time talking about applications right now. But let's go back to the console over here and look at it. So you can see here if an image is captured or not. You can see we note the yes that if it's your captured image. If it doesn't have that, it's the source files. And here you can see for Windows 8.1, I have my source files. And then I do have three actually different versions of captured image for the same version. So you only have to import those source files one time, and you can have as many captured images as you want. And on the side here is where you do your importing from source. So you take your ISO or DVD and you just pop that in there. If you want to start an image capture, you click on here and you would just browse that computer name in Active Directory. And you can see here, we have a few things here that we check for. You want to make sure that we can get to it. So typically your firewall would have to be turned off because that would stop you from reading it. You have to be able to connect to the remote registry. You have to have the valid task sequence. This step here, this valid task sequence, that's because it's looking for those task sequences from importing the source files. Really important for that to do that. We have really some good blog articles out there on capturing. We could probably spend a whole webinar, and maybe in the future at some time we could just talk about best practices for capturing and creating those golden images, because there's a lot to go into it. But basically, as long as you can get to it, have those services started, you'd hit execute at this point. I don't want to kill my VM, so I'm not going to do that. It would start the capture. And once it does that, we remove it from the domain, we sysprep it, we create the WIM, and we copy the WIM image to the server. And then once it's done, we would just import that captured image here, and you see it in your console. Then it's available to be chosen to actually be imported, and you can use it to deploy out to your machines at that point. So the next part after we talk about images is the driver management. because this is where we separate the drivers from the OS, that your images is OS only. You could put those images on multiple hardware platforms because of the driver management console. So here you can add your make and model folders, you import your drivers, you can delete them and go through properties of it. And it's really important, and those of you who have done installs with me, I walk you through how to create these driver folders, because the alias of the folder matches the WMI name for that make and model, and that's how we match it up ahead of time. So here, the alias is, for example, latitude E6520. But I know for some other manufacturers, it may not be necessarily the name of the model of the computer. So I always encourage you to browse for an Active Directory. You can add a child make and model folder from a computer by going out and browsing it in your Active Directory. And then therefore all the properties are correct. You can also add OS folders in here. So if we want to say we want to add drivers for a particular operating system, you can add a new child folder and say I'm going to do my Windows 8. That one already exists. So let's try Windows 8.1. Here we go. And then you could just import whatever you need into these folders. I like to personally organize them by operating system, because if you dump them all into the model folder and then you get rid of, say, Windows 7 in your environment, how are you going to know which drivers to delete? So this way, once you get rid of them, you could delete one folder at a time and then go on. You also see we have this WinPE folder. Another option to do is sometimes, because the WinPE uses the Windows 8.1 driver and you might have a Windows 7 shop, you can actually create your own WinPE driver, WinPE driver folder. So then you could just put the drivers in there and that's what it can use for boot up. And there's a great blog article on our blog going into details for how to do that. Policies. So I did start the webinar talking about policies. So we have the group management console is one place where we'll get policies from because we have a plugin into there. Then we can edit our default policy. We can list all the different group policies you have and a naming policy pattern. So I'm going to go here and let's just look at the default policy. The default policy applies to all computers that does not have a group policy object. Some settings that we have in here, enabling real-time logging, I always say put that to yes. It's extremely important because you see your real-time logging as you're doing the builds. Your operating system images, you can list if you have 32 or 64-bit image here. So in your default policy, you're going to put the image in here that you want to get as your default image. You can put your organization name if you wanted to use WSUS or not in here, and also in your environmental settings for your time zone settings. Now, I want to pop out here and just show you the settings from a group policy object perspective. So you come here and we put a plugin here right into the GPMC on your Specops server. And a lot of times I know customers aren't even aware that you can do this. That's why I want to take the time to point out to you, because the flexibility that you have there, and you can have many of these. So in your environment, you have different images for different departments or groups of computers. You could set this filtered on security groups, on different OUs, depending upon how your Active Directory is set up. And here, the first setting is one of the ones that you do not have in the default policy. Allow reinstallation when operating system's running. That's to do a reinstall. So a lot of times in the reinstall wizard, you could see the option to do that and save your user data or just do a default reinstall. That does not pixie boot. That actually boots off of your client-side extension. And if you do not set up a group policy object for OS deploy, you're not going to be able to use that. You're only going to be able to do the pre-staging and pixie booting. So it's important to have this checkbox here to do that. You can also do your enable real-time logging, set your local admin password. One other thing here I want to point out is we can have this deployment server override. So if you want a certain set of computers to go to specific deployment server, maybe not the one local on your subnet, you can actually do that override. And from time to time, I've seen the way networks are set up and the VLANs are set up. We've had to use that with customers. Can't do that in the default policy. So keep going through here. You can see your default images. You get your drop down here to set what image you want for that policy. If you want to have WSUS or Windows Update set up automatically there. Here you could do your language and environmental settings. And also any custom entity properties you want to add, I always suggest adding the X resolution and Y resolution value to 1, so your screen is stretched to the optimal configuration. So that's something I always like to add in. And that's it. So it's pretty simple to set up these group policies in there. It's important to know and do that. And on the group policy tab here in the OS admin console, it takes a second to open, but you can actually see all those group policies listed. Always takes forever here at this point because we're filling, they're querying the AD for the group policy. So I know it takes a moment or two for this to happen. But here we go. And you can see all the individual group policies listed. So if you want to see what you have out here, so I can go to mine that we just looked at, and you can take a look at there and pop it open. Then the last piece is the naming policy pattern. The naming policy pattern is if your computer objects follow a pattern, and when you pre-stage them, you can auto-generate the names. And I'll show you that when we get to the pre-stage screen. Now, if you use like your location or the MAC address or serial number, you're not going to be able to use this. But this is more if your computers follow patterns such as Specops 001, the Specops 002. You could set up a pattern within here to do that. All right, and deployments. So this screen is where we're going to do our pre-staging, our reinstallation, and if you want to export any information or view logs, is that tab of the console. And here it can get a little bit crazy. So if we want to do a reinstall of a computer, I'm going to jump down here to the Reinstall tab. And I'm going to take my machine here, Juliet 2, and I want to do a reinstall of that. And I'm going to do a reinstall, not a pre-stage in Pixie Boot. The difference, as I just said, is we're going to use a client-side extension to boot into WinPE instead of Pixie booting. So a reinstall will be for a computer that's already in your Active Directory and live. And it has to have the deploy client-side extension installed on it. And it also has to have a group policy object. The reinstall options, there's two types. The default, where they're going to save your user data. So that's your user profile data. It will copy it off and bring it back. Or you could do a default and discard the user data. Now, if we select a reboot and reformat, that's going to actually go and do a Pixie boot for the reboot and reformat option. So I'm going to leave it at 2. And here I'm going to attempt a GP update because I'm going to force a GP update to go. And once that goes, then it's going to start the reinstallation process. So I'm going to say next, execute. It's sending the GP update. And once it does that, it actually takes a few moments to kick off on the machine. Now, one way to do it is from the OS admin console. You can also start the same process from users and computers. And I just want to point out here, now that I did this, I see my icon pop up. Same thing as when you pre-stage, you see it grayed out there ready to go. Now, it's going to take a few minutes to see this going. So I would like to point out to you the reinstall wizard that you can also do the same thing right from ADUCT. I can right click, say operating system reinstall. So there's a few ways to get the same thing. And you can see it's starting to kick off over here. So let that run on the side. But I get the same wizard that we just saw from the OS admin console. You can also run that wizard on multiple computers at one time too. So if I want to select 2 computers, or it's not letting me select today. All right, we'll do it from the OU. Doesn't want to play nice with me. And I'm not going to go all the way through with it, but I just want to show you the screen here that if you select more than one computer, it's going to look at the operating system and then kick off on you on that. That's really handy in a lab environment. Say if you had a computer, a lab that you want to refresh at the end of Friday in like a school, for example, you can have them all in one OU, right click on the OU and just let it go. And so you can see here, it's booting the client-side extension in the WinPE. It's going to connect to the deploy server. And those of you who've used deploy see the whole process. It's going to bring down the image and the whole thing. And here I call this my flux capacitor. You can see now it has connected to the image or the deployment server you see here listed, and it's going to start logging, generating the real-time install log, and doing everything along the way. Let's actually take a look to see if it started yet. And you can turn on auto scroll with the log viewer. And I like because a lot of times if I don't have a VM, I'm actually not going to see the screen in front of me of what's going on when it's a physical computer out there. So this way you can see what's going on. And when the log ends, it actually says you're at the end of the log. So it's really good for troubleshooting and figuring out what's going on. Or as an administrator, you just want to see where your computer's at in the build, especially if you have a bigger image and it's a longer build. So that button I told you where it said in the policy to enable real-time logging, that is what actually allows this log to run. That's why I always say it's important to do that. So I showed you the reinstallation, but we haven't talked about pre-staging. Pre-staging is when you get that computer from the manufacturer. There's no OS on it. It's not in your Active Directory. Or for some reason, your live computer bombed out, crashed, failed, and you can't log into it. It's not able to be on your Active Directory. So you can either take the netboot GUID or the MAC address and do what we call the pre-stage. The MAC address obviously is much shorter than your netboot GUID. So you could pop in a MAC address right in here. And go next. When you do a pre-stage, you cannot have the computer object in your Active Directory because part of pre-staging is we create the computer object for you. So if you use this method for a machine that is already in your Active Directory, then what you need to do is delete the computer object, pre-stage it, and it'll recreate the computer accounts. So I'm going to come down to my OU here. Say next, and then type in your computer name. Now this generate name, that's where that naming policy pattern will come in handy. And because I do have a pattern in place, it populated with Juliet 04. If you do not use that naming policy pattern because your naming scheme won't match that, just type in the computer name automatically there. But if you do have a nice scheme that we follow here, saves a few moments. I say execute. So what that did is it created my computer object, it pre-staged it, and Juliet 4 is here, is waiting. So then the next time when I take that machine, I turn that on my network the first time, bam, it's going to boot up, Pixie boot, connect to the server, and do very similar to what we see going on here. And here you can see this computer still going on. It's applying progress, applying the image, and then we'll keep going through its process there. So any questions? I know we covered a lot of information here. I want to just take a deeper dive into the console. So let me take a look here. I know we've had some questions coming in. Okay, first question here I have is, what's the big difference between an MDT and a Specops solution? Great question, because I know we do talk about MDT, and MDT is a solution you do get from Microsoft, and that you can use that solely on itself. Problem is, MDT can be quite complex, a lot of task sequence. It can take a lot of time. So with using Specops, where your GUI interface to MDT, it's much simpler. With MDT, we can, with Deploy, we do your driver management and we inject everything into MDT for you. So with OS Deploy, we're really zero touch. You get real-time feedback. It's easy to set up and maintain, which MDT takes a lot more time. So, all right, the next question I have. If I buy 100 computers, how can I get Specops deployed to all 100 machines in a simple way without touching the computers? Well, simplest way we say is for the MAC address because you get 100 new machines in doing the pre-stage. Yeah, I can definitely agree. That could take a little bit of time, pre-staging one by one, but we can actually use a pre-stage by file. And let me pull that up here because I did not show you guys that yet. So with that, you can have the pre-stage from file button here, and you can actually use a naming scheme or have a file, CSV or text file, with the computer name on it and the MAC address or netboot GUID, and then you can pull that in a swoop and pre-stage, which will be much quicker. All right, someone says Log Viewer, a newer feature. They didn't think they had in our 4.8 environment. That Log Viewer's been around for a while. You should have it. The Log Viewer is actually, though, a separate install. If you go into your Setup Assistant, you'll see the setup for Deploy, OS Deploy, App Deploy, and then there's Deploy Endpoint. Go into OS Deploy, and then you set up the image server. You'll have your admin tool set up, and then there's the log viewer set up. So take a look in there for the log viewer. Can't remember exactly, Sebastian, if it's 4.8 or not, which it came in. I'd be surprised if it's not in there, but definitely in the newer versions you have it. And if you're a customer, your support and maintenance agreements include upgrades to the new version. So you can always take a look and upgrade it. But go into your Setup Assistant to see if it's in there. And the nice thing I love about Log Viewer is that you can actually use it for more than SpecOps logs. I actually use it for tons of logs because the way we parse it, it's easier to view. It's more searchable. So I would suggest use that. And if you have any other SpecOps products, some of our password products, I use it for the logs for there, and products outside of SpecOps you can use it for. And also to going back to the deploy and MDT, there is a great resource on our website, and we do have a comparison article too for deploy and MDT. So if you want to go back there, you could take a look at that and read that also. It's in the chat window if you see that. All right, I have another question here. If I have a tablet without a network card built in, only Wi-Fi, can I still use Specops Deploy to reinstall it for tablets? Absolutely. If you have a USB network dongle, and you can use the default reinstall mode to do that. Otherwise, we do have something called the Specops USB solution. If you go to our website, some of my colleagues came up with that. And then for some reason, sometimes in networks, you can't pixie boot for some reason, just the way your network's set up. So you can actually create a USB or a USB stick to do the pixie boot. So that's another option that you can use with the tablets also. All right, question comes in about, I have a Wi-Fi network for my school with SSID school Wi-Fi and a password in it. Is it possible to configure that in a machine during installation? Absolutely, with App Deploy, you can set it up that if you want to do your configuration for the Wi-Fi, you can do that. And that's something in our session in 2 weeks that we'll be talking about more with that. All right, does anyone else have any questions out there about Deploy? I'll give it another minute or two to see if anyone has any more questions coming in. All right. Well, with that, we can wrap it up today. Thanks again for joining. In 2 weeks, on August 20th, we're going to be doing it SpecOps Deploy app. Johan will be joining me again. And I know in our first session 2 weeks ago, we did have a request to take a look at Java, to how to do Java deployments with App Deploy. So you can look forward to that coming. And if there's any other feedback you'd like, please send it our way. Anything you'd like to see specifically with Deploy app, we'd be happy to address anything specific. And as always, we will have Q&A at the end, so any questions you have about that. And look for the future sessions, that it's going to be a really good week. later in the month when we have the advanced session, and we'll really talk about tuning some more stuff with MDT. So have a good rest of your week and enjoy your weekend.